Welcome to our panel, Breaking News or Making News, Media Coverage of the White House. My name is Nina Bose. I'm the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs at Hofstra and the Director of our Peter S. Kalkow Center for the Study of the American Presidency. And it's today for a very timely and important discussion with three experts from journalism, electoral politics, and White House politics as well. I'll introduce our speakers in just a moment, and we'll move into the discussion. Let me just briefly give a warm welcome and thanks to the classes that are joining us today. We have Professor Semple's copywriting class, Professor Wu's media literacy course, Professor Labenberg's voice and diction course, Professor Burnett's state and local politics course, my American politics course. I don't see any of you, but where are you guys? Oh, there you are. Okay, good. From Island Trees High School, Mr. Rigo's class. It's wonderful to have all of you here. Look right up front. Thank you all for joining us. Many thanks to everyone in the community, friends, colleagues, who have taken the time to join us today. Special thanks to Mr. Rick Nasty from Peter Kalkow's office, and I understand that we have some guests who will be joining us as well. I'm very delighted that you could be here today. We developed this panel because it seemed that this year, as we've studied American politics, and particularly presidential leadership and policymaking, that the question of news and what is news, the legitimacy of news, has really come into question. And I should mention that next week, on October 25th, Hofstra is hosting a day of dialogue, and the title, in fact, is F***E News. That, of course, is referring to, or fake news, and a series of discussions throughout the day about politics and news coverage and information gathering. You'll find a full schedule of events online on Hofstra's website, and we have a number of other events that there are flyers for outside as well. For our purposes today, we're focusing on media coverage of the White House and the tension, I think it's a fair word to describe, between what elected officials, particularly in the Oval Office, are saying or tweeting, and we'll get into the specifics in a moment, and how journalists interpret, cover the media, how information is received by the public. To address these topics, I'm delighted to introduce three expert speakers on the subject. First, we have Mr. Tom DeFrank, who's a contributing editor at the National Journal. Mr. DeFrank has a reputation as one of the best-sourced journalists in Washington, and I know from extensive conversations with him about several of the 10 presidents that he has covered in his career, that indeed that description is correct. Mr. DeFrank began his career actually as the editor of his college newspaper in Texas, went on as an intern for Newsweek to, I think, travel with President Johnson at the end of his term, and then went on to cover more than a dozen presidential campaigns. First, as senior White House correspondent for Newsweek for 25 years, and then as Washington bureau chief of the New York Daily News. Mr. DeFrank is the author of the book, Write It When I'm Gone, a book about President Ford based on 30 years of private conversations. In 2006, Mr. DeFrank won the Gerald R. Ford Prize for Distinguished Presidential Reporting. He has reported from all 50 states and almost 50 countries, is a former president of the White House Correspondents Association. Early in his career, he covered the return of U.S. prisoners of war from Vietnam at Clark Air Base in the Philippines, and was on active duty at the Pentagon from 1968 to 1970 as a public affairs officer. Before he joined Newsweek, he was a reporter for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram in Texas, and as well as for the Daily Eagle and the Minneapolis Star. We're delighted that he's with us today. He's also, I neglected to mention, he is the co-author of the best-selling memoir of Republican political consultant Ed Rollins, Bare Knuckles and Back Room. And we have Mr. Rollins joining us as well today. Mr. Rollins is a senior presidential fellow at the Kalkow Center at Hofstra. He is one of the country's leading political strategists and communications experts. He managed Ronald Reagan's 49-state landslide re-election victory in the Electoral College in 1984 and has had major managerial roles in almost a dozen other presidential campaigns. He's served in the administrations of 4 U.S. presidents, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and George H.W. Bush, including 2 tours of duty at the highest staff appointment in the White House, assistant to the president. Under President Reagan, Mr. Rollins directed the White House Offices of Political Affairs and Intergovernmental Affairs, and also served as Deputy Chief of Staff during President Reagan's second term. He was the first non-member of Congress to serve as chairman of the National Republican Congressional Committee. He is a frequent commentator on on Fox News, and is a member of, was inducted a few years ago into the American Association of Political Consultants Hall of Fame. Our third panelist, Governor Howard Dean, is a former Democratic National Committee chairman, U.S. presidential candidate, 6th-term governor of Vermont, and practicing physician. Governor Dean is also a senior presidential fellow at the Kalkow Center at Hofstra. He is currently a senior advisor and consultant for the government affairs practice at Denton's LLP, an international law firm. He focuses on healthcare and alternative energy. Governor Dean is an MSNBC contributor and the founder of Democracy for America. Also, he serves on the board of the National Democratic Institute, focusing on the promotion of democracy in Southeast Europe and China. Governor Dean transitioned from full-time practicing physician to elected office in 1982 in Vermont, served as governor for 12 years, left office to run for president in 2003, where he implemented innovative fundraising strategies at the time, including use of the internet. As chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Governor Dean created and implemented the 50 Straight strategy that was widely credited with helping the Democrats make historic gains in 2006 and 2008. Please join me in welcoming our 3 speakers. To begin this discussion, I was conducting research last night, and I was just about to close my computer, always a risky strategy these days, when I looked at Twitter, and at 10:03 p.m., there was a tweet from the president. 46% of Americans think media is inventing stories about Trump and his administration, and then the president added, "It is actually much worse than this!" Exclamation point. The president was citing a poll from Politico that suggests that nearly half the public does not have confidence in the media. Now, I found this poll interesting because about just 2 weeks ago, there was a Reuters poll that found that 48% of the public say they have a great deal or some confidence in the press. That was 9 points higher than when the same organization took the poll in November 2016. The president's approval ratings are, depending on which poll you look at, between 39 to 44%. So at the very start of this session, there's a question, and I think, Tom, I'll turn to you about this. What do we make of the public opinion polls, the Reuters poll that shows confidence in the media, the Politico poll that raises questions about news coverage, and the president's use of social media as a tool of communication?
Well, all of this, I think, suggests a volatility in public opinion about the press, but I'm not surprised about this, Mina, because the press is unloved. It's always going to be unloved. It does tell me that President Trump's campaign against the media is having a little bit of effect, but I don't worry about this a whole lot, because it's what people's view of the press really is a function of what they think. If you love President Trump, you're going to think the media is out to get him. If you don't like President Trump, you'll think the media is doing God's work. And I want to tell a quick story which buttresses my point. I was lecturing on a cruise ship in the second term of George W. Bush. This was about 6 years into his 8 years. And at that point, the cruise line had asked me to do a personality speech on Bush, on the theory that after 6 years, you either loved him or didn't love him, but you knew what you thought about him. So talk about his personality, and I did that. And my wife, who is an ex-journalist, that's all my stuff, and she says, this is right down the middle, and nobody's going to be upset about this. Well, after my presentation, some very nice lady from Tennessee came up to me, and she said, I trust that the next time you speak about our president, you won't trash him like you just did. Well, I was taken aback, trying to figure out what I was going to say, but I was saved by her husband, who came up and said, honey, you're all wrong. He didn't trash Bush. He was very respectful. Well, they got into a big argument, which gave me an opportunity to get out of there. I go to the elevator to change clothes, and the elevator doors open, and some guy looked at me and he said, are you on the payroll of George W. Bush? If not, you should be on the payroll. You're totally in the tank for the guy. Well, I wanted to say to both, but didn't, because I wanted to be invited back on the cruise line. I wanted to say to both, were we at the same presentation? But that was the day that I realized that people are going to think what they want to think, which is fine. They will hear what they want to hear, and just don't worry about it. As I said earlier, this suggests that President Trump's relentless barrage about the press, which is not the first time I've seen a movie like this, is having some effect. But I'm just not going to worry about it. I think if you ask most Americans, would they be happier with no press or with a press that they don't like sometimes, I think they'd be happier with the latter. So I just don't worry about it myself.
Howard, would you like to comment on we were discussing this morning the political divisions in public opinion polls?
Sure. Let me make two comments about this. The first is, as Ed knows, who probably read more polls than everybody else in the room combined, he actually was Lincoln's campaign manager before he was Reagan's campaign manager. So he did well, too. But if you can't see the internals on a poll, you really have no idea. And one of the questions we were talking about, this Fox Politico poll, for all we know, a quarter of those people are Democrats who think Fox News makes up stories that are too favorable to the president. So unless you see the internals in the poll, which is the inside questions, how they were asked, who they were asked to, and then, as Ed will point out, the sample. You ask too many Democrats, and you're going to get one answer. You ask too many, if your sample's not exactly right. That's hard to do in these days of the internet, and nobody has a landline anymore and all this stuff. So we don't really know what this poll, it's entertaining. But there was a great poll that I loved from Fox. I never love anything from Fox, right? Except Ed. But there was a great poll that suggested that we have a shot in Alabama, that among intensely interested and voted, the Democratic candidate in Alabama is 4 points ahead of Roy Moore. Now, I'd like to be optimistic. I'd like to have to see the internals of that one, given that Alabama voted 28% plus for Trump. So that's the first point I want to make is these polls are fine. They're entertaining. They don't really mean anything. And it's why, in my opinion, during races, you want to follow Nate Silver or Nate Cohn or somebody like that on 538, because they're doing aggregates. And if you do a huge aggregates of polls, these differences in sampling and the differences in how you ask the questions all get ironed out if you're looking at 25 respectable polls. He actually rates the pollsters, so you know which ones you should generally avoid and which ones actually are mostly accurate. And there's some interesting things there, but that's another subject for another class, but that's the first point. The second point is, here's why people have trouble with journalism. I've thought about this a lot, and I teach some about this. In fact, I used to love to go into Hofstra classes. I'd get dragged into a journalism class once in a while, and I could always pick up, somebody had a copy of the New York Times. After all, this is a journalism class. Here it is. Let's see if there's always a political, I haven't seen the Times this morning, there's always a political story. President cools on Senate deal for health fix. Okay, so I'm going to just see if this works. We already have this. This is two really well-respected reporters for the New York Times. Robert Peer, who knows probably more about healthcare than almost any reporter in the country, except for Jonathan Cohen. So the third paragraph, the mixed signals began Tuesday when Mr. Trump appeared to give his blessing to a deal to restore subsidies to health insurance that he said days before he had cut off. Mr. Alexander and Mrs. Murray agreed on legislation that would continue, blah, 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 blah. So already the reporter is giving his opinion of what Trump said. Now, these are good reporters. It's not like they're making up the news. Here's what happens in the cycle when you report. This is human nature, and you can't do anything about it. Tom interviews me. Okay, I give my story to Tom that I think is my story. But Tom has a life and an experience, and he writes the story through his own filter, not because he's trying to screw up what I say, but because his filter is not the same as mine. I read Tom's story, and I get mad because I think this isn't what I said. And then you read Tom's story, and you put it through your filter because that's your life experiencing, now interpreting what he's written in good faith. So the impression that you get has at least to do in some, and we're talking about respectable, reasonable reporters who are trying to do the right thing. We're not talking about people who do make up the news, and there are some. But so what in any news magazine or on television or whatever, it's sometimes people do intentionally change the story around and do bad things. But most of the time, it's good faith. And part of the problem, like the guy in the elevator came out of the elevator and accused him of being on the payroll of the Bush administration, is they're seeing this through their filter. Stuff that you didn't intend to be in there. If it weren't for their filter, they wouldn't see it that way. So the bias is not always in the reporter. It's partly in the subject, partly in the reporter, because they have to have their own biases, and partly in the reader. And that is an inescapable fact about human beings that we're never going to change in the press corps. I personally have hated the press for a long time. I actually think they're getting better. Not because they're after Trump every day, but because I think the competition is so tough that they're actually working hard on improving themselves and getting through this crisis that they have in this switch from print over to social media. I think it's actually, I use the Washington Post, which I hated for years and wouldn't read. Now Bezos is subsidizing the hell out of it, and he's going to be very controversial because of his management practices, but it's one of the hottest places in the country now for young people who want to get a reporting job.
Well, if I can pick up on that, Ed, with a question, because it seems to me that the New York Times assessment of the events of the last couple of days is quite fair. And as far as the subsidies for healthcare and whether there will be legislation passed to counter what the president said. But I think your point is well taken, Howard, about the filters and the need for educated consumers as well as educated officials. We've had a tumultuous first year in the Trump presidency where the president has raised many questions about the concept fake news is now a term we use in regular discourse. There was a suggestion that the president made, the president said last week that he thought NBC should have their license revoked. Didn't like what they said about, reported that he had called for 10,000 more nuclear warheads, reportedly. There have been quite a free speech issues in the NFL, which started out as kind of one person last fall. It's grown bigger, and now appears to be turning into a First Amendment issue. And I guess, Ed, if you could speak from a White House, not necessarily this White House, but from a White House perspective, we've never had a president challenge the media in this way and use social media as a tool to counter the mainstream news media, if you will. So is this strategy effective for the White House, and what are the consequences for American democracy?
As the introduction said, I've been around the game for a long time and had the privilege of working with first-rate journalists and some not so first-rate, some first-rate political people, some great presidents, some not great presidents. I think we're in a very reflective period today, and I want to. Tom DeFrank is one of the great journalists of my lifetime. And when I came time to write my book, I needed a collaborator. I had never written a book before at a very short time frame. He was someone who, for 25 years, covered the White House with Newsweek. He was the most respected guy of all the reporters covering the White House because he was always fair, and whatever he came to you knowing the story, and whatever you gave him as the story, he was not going to put his interpretation into it. He was going to basically add it to the pieces that need. And the difference in journalism today, this was in the 80s, every Saturday night, you would wait for Newsweek, and you would wait for the other news magazine called Time. I think Newsweek is now at about 4 pages, and it's all digital. And I think the key thing is the Second Amendment to me is the most important amendment we have. It's what keeps us free. I mean, I'm sorry.
First.
Spoken like a true Republican, the Second Amendment, right?
I was.
I thought we moved to a different panel.
My thought process was going to be, this is what happens to an old man. My thought process was most Republicans think the Second Amendment is the most important amendment, and the First Amendment is what keeps people who have the Second Amendment from shooting people like Tom DeFrank and Dr. Dean and myself. There's nothing more important than basically have the ability to go look and examine what we do as a government. We have an extraordinary government. We have different. Dean and I teach a course in the American Presidency, and when Trump got elected, I said, whatever we've taught in the past is going to be totally irrelevant. Trump is going to create a whole new category. I'm a Republican. I supported Trump. I still attempt to defend the indefensible on some days, and other days I basically just keep my mouth shut. Trump understands the new media, and I think to a certain extent, one of the really critical parts when Tom was in the White House, covering the White House, when I was in the White House, the President would put out a news release. The President put out a press release. The press release was thought through. It was checked off. It was usually 99% accurate. There weren't misspelled words. There weren't the facts was interpreted by a lot of different people. And he would never put out something that was deliberately misleading. Today, Donald Trump gets up at 5:30 and he puts out a tweet and people get it. By the time most of us get up at 6:30, it's on MSNBC or Fox News or what have you. And by 9 o'clock, there's 12 more tweets, and it's reproduced by millions and millions of people. So every single morning, 50 million people get a Trump Twitter, and half may be for him, half may be against him. But that's his story. That's what he announces his people that way. I don't think there's been a press release out of his White House. You cover it, so I don't know. And I guess what I'm saying is the game has changed dramatically. When I grew up, I'm 74 years old. We gathered around at 6:30 at night and watched the network news. We watched the Dan Rathers of the world, and we watched the Tom Brokaws and the Brinkleys and the Huntleys. And what they said we felt was credible. When you picked up the New York Times or what have you, and the other part of the New York Times, at the top says, all the news that's fit to print. Well, it's not all the news that's fit to print. It's all the news that the New York Times has decided is fit to print. And what you have today is, this is a perfect example. This is I do everything on this. That's 16 papers that I read every day. And there's another 8 papers that I read every day. Now, fortunately, I'm at a point in my life where I have the time to read. If you want to learn what's going on, there are so many options that you have today. But the critical thing is there's so much clutter that you have to make sure you distinguish what it is that you want to read. And young people today, and I have a 22-year-old daughter who I know I finally trained well. I said, where do you get your news? She said to me, well, Dad, I get Skim. You've got to subscribe to Skim. Skim is kind of like birthdays, little tiny things. It's like headlines. So last week I was having dinner with her. I said, I've been reading Skim. I don't get any news. What do you get? She says, well, Dad, you've now taught me to read Breitbart and to read Huffington Post and to read the New York Post and to read the New York Times. And I guess what I say to you is, if you really are interested in the game, you basically are getting news, you have to understand there's different points of view. Equally as important, Fox attempts to tell a story from a point of view, MSNBC attempts to tell a story from a different perspective. And there's plenty of news out there. The battle always is the White House is who sets the national agenda. Is the New York Times, Washington Post going to set the national agenda, or is the president going to set the national agenda? And I would argue in the 9 months of Trump, or the 18 months that Trump's been around, he is the celebrity show. He is the constant. 6 o'clock every morning, my wife said to me, "Are we at war? What's new? What has Trump done today?" And everybody gets up looking for that. And we're now in this age of celebrities, and clearly he's a celebrity president. History will decide whether he's a great president or a good president or a mediocre president. We all may have our impressions today, but the reality is there's three factions. There's people like us that basically live with it, people like you that watch it every day. We make judgments on what's going on today. Howard's on MSNBC, I'm on Fox every day. I give my interpretations. 5 years from now, the political scientists are all going to look at this and they're going to say, no, that's really not what happened. What really happened was X, Y, and Z. And 25 years from now, the historians are going to look back on it when all the facts and figures come forward, and they're going to say, well, that's what people thought, but here's really what happened. Presidency is an ever-moving thing. The coverage of the presidency is very, very critical. But the best counsel I had when I first became a political director, my mentor was a guy named Len Hofstra. Len was a great reporter who was the bureau chief at the top of newspapers and became Ronald Reagan's press secretary when he went as governor. He said to me, you've got to understand, journalists have an obligation to tell a story. You have an obligation to try and make sure they're telling our story. They're never going to tell our story, but you have to be honest with them so that when there is a story that's going off track and it's not honest, you can go to them. I could go to a Tom DeFrank and say, Tom, someone gave you that counsel. That's not really what happened. If he trusts me, which I think he obviously did, he won't write that story or he'll change it or move it to a different place. We had the opportunity, again, to do a book together, which the book would still be in the process 25 years of being written if I had to write it myself. Tom basically kept me on the straight and narrow, basically made sure it was as honest a book as possible. And I think to a certain extent we became better friends, and we've been great friends at that point in time. The 4 months of very intense writing a book, the book was for the future, for young people to see what life and what political strategy is all about. I think the problem is we have a lot of young people today who want to go into journalism. There's not the opportunities they once had to go into journalism. And I think to a certain extent I worry about the game because it's not just a question of the propaganda. It's not just a question of the White House controlling it. The reality is there's so many other elements that control it. If you have a president like this president, and you started on the health story, the reason the health story is different is the night before he said, I'm agreeing on this, and this looks great, we're having bipartisan support, and 3 hours later this story came across, he's killing it. I think Trump makes up his mind as he goes along, and I think to a certain extent that's part of the confusion, part of the difficulty in covering him as opposed to somebody else. Equally as important, he's very combative. As a communications specialist, as a guy who's worked for presidents, he drives me absolutely insane from a communications perspective. He'll give a speech to the United Nations, get wide applaud, go down the next day and basically make an event in Alabama or someone else to take on the NFL. We spend all weekend, instead of talking about the UN speech or Korea or somewhere else, we're talking about the National Football League. Now, that doesn't mean that the National Football League is not important to some people, but to show you the power of the media today, when we started this season, I'm a big football fan, when we started this season, the NFL was the favorite sport for most Americans. It had a 70% favorability rating. In 4 weeks of fighting over the anthem and genuflecting, standing up for the anthem, it's now dropped 30%. The ratings have dropped off dramatically. The stories have big impact. The debate that's going on today, front page stories everywhere today, and how important is the NFL compared to all the other things going on in the world? But it's just the drumbeat, and it moves so fast and so quickly. And if you basically take 24, 48 hours off, the world continues to move forward. But I think to a certain extent it's harder and harder for journalists to cover what's going on. And the real dilemma for me is not just the big papers and the big news stations. It's who in the future is going to be able to cover Albany? Who's going to be able to cover Rochester? Who's going to be able to cover Sacramento? Who's going to cover Vermont? The places where sometimes there is corruption and there needs to be exposure. There's no money in these little papers anymore. There's no young journalists want to go into it anymore. And I think to a certain extent that's the endangerment of society. If you don't have an open and free society where people can basically believe that the government is honest and decent, or that they're getting a full story, then you get more and more cynical. So I just say to these young people going on with journalism, want to go to journalism, what have you, it's more challenging than it was when Tom started. And Tom worked very hard to have an extraordinary career. And he built a career of trust to such an extent, an incumbent president of the United States, who became his friend Gerald Ford, every day, every week or so, gave him stories not to be published till Ford passed on. You think about that extraordinary trust. If you take a journalist and you trust him to such an extent that you would basically tell him, these are the things I want to be said about me when I go, these are true stories. And to me, that's one of the great compliments to Tom. More important, it's great tragedies is not going to be Tom DeFranks in the future. Okay.
Well, let me actually pick up, Ed, on that point. With Tom, you've covered a dozen presidents, so you've seen the evolution of the press corps from the pre-Watergate era, right, to where we are now. And you and I were speaking yesterday about covering the president, right, how the president engages with the press. And could you say a few words about how we know, obviously, that the Trump White House interaction with the media is very different from all of the predecessors, but we've also seen some parallels here. I think some of the challenges about filters, how people receive information, those haven't necessarily changed. So could you speak a little bit as to what is unique in this White House's relationship with the press corps as far as the briefings, the president's interaction, the press secretary, and then if you would also say a little bit about how the media as an institution can counter these charges of fake news. Because even with the dozen sources that Ed uses and the multiplicity of national, local, international reporting, the question of credibility is kind of fundamental for the media to be able to do its job.
Well, let me give you all a little bit of context here. I have noticed, and it's 10 presidents. As you mentioned earlier, I went on a trip with LBJ as a Newsweek intern to dedicate a dam in Tennessee, and I didn't know anything about anything. I actually thought that the entire press corps went on Air Force One with the president. And I spent a Friday night working up my questions because I was sure I was going to have a chance to ask a couple of them with President Johnson. I get out to National Airport, and the press corps is going on to Eastern Airlines turbojet, and I said, "Where's Air Force One?" And an old reporter said, "Son, have you never heard of a press plane?" Well, I'd never heard of a press plane. That shows you how green I was. But I do go back to LBJ. But there is a given here, and that is, over time, every new administration adopts a communications policy that is a little more less friendly to the media. Basically, every new administration comes in and they have briefings during the transition with the outgoing president's staff, and the new administration's communications people examine the outgoing administration's communications strategy, and they add their own little twists, and almost inevitably the new twist is there's less access than there used to be. I mean, I think the Reagan administration was the most grown up about all of this. Their attitude was, well, if we had a bad day today with the press, there's always tomorrow. They wanted to engage. They realized that a bad story could be fixed if you continue to treat reporters as grown-ups and deal with them as grown-ups. Since that time, I think it's become more and more difficult for reporters to get news, and I say that referring to Republican presidents and Democratic presidents. But it's a mixed bag also with the Trump administration. I mean, there are a lot of things that used to be routinely available to reporters that aren't available anymore. We don't get a president's tax returns. We don't have any medical data on the president. The spokeswoman has asked, was he going to go to Walter Reed or Bethesda to have a medical exam, and will we get that information? And she said, if that happens, we'll get back to you. There's no longer any record of who visits the White House. That public access is gone for the most part. And so there's generically less information in the Trump White House. However, there's probably been fewer press conferences, but I have to say President Trump has been meeting with reporters more lately. That press conference the other day in the Rose Garden, where he took questions from people who never get questions in press conferences, was commendable. I mean, you could argue about his answers here and there, but I mean, the access was positive. The other thing that is noticeable with this press operation is, and I would say, a graduate student or somebody would have an interesting story or thesis or whatever if they went back and examined how long White House press briefings run in the Reagan days. Yesterday's White House press briefing lasted for 24 minutes. 24 minutes, and that's usually the norm, 20 to 25 minutes if you don't count the opening monologue or 5 minutes with the Secretary of the Treasury. The amount of time available for dialogue between reporters and the spokesperson is going down steadily in this White House. And that's one thing. I mean, the Obama people sometimes took it to the other extreme. Their spokesman sometimes would let questions go on in the briefing room for over an hour. I mean, even reporters were begging for mercy at that point. That's a long time. But here, there's almost no opportunity for dialogue. The follow-ups are fleeting. You can't really engage. So that's a new phenomenon. I mean, I know many of you were in the military, and I will clean up the phrase that we in the Army used to know very well. Stuff rolls downhill. And what that means is the commander sets the tone, and it's true in every aspect of military life, and it's also true in situations like this. The president, the commander-in-chief, sets the tone, and I think it's pretty clear, with a few exceptions, that President Trump is not a big fan of the president of the press corps. Just look at his tweets, and I think that attitude filters down. So all things considered, it's a little more difficult for reporters to do their job with this White House than in previous White Houses, Democratic or Republican. But I also think, for the most part, the difficulties reporters have in doing their job, for the most part, are not usually news. Reporters always want more access. There's never enough, and we sometimes whine a little bit too much. My basic view is just allow me to go to the briefings, give me your handouts, I'll make my own judgments. I don't need to be invited to movies in the White House. I don't need to be invited to state dinners. That's not important to me. I'm sure it was important to me 35 years ago. It's not important to me any longer. So it goes. It's more difficult than it used to be, but we don't have a divine right to have our jobs be made less difficult. I mean, the president sets the tone, his administration sets the tone, and we're not going to. There are hurdles in this White House, and that's the way it's always going to be. The next president, whoever he or she may be, will probably have more hurdles for reporters to deal with. It's just the nature of the beast.
Tom, just a quick follow-up. As a former president of the White House Correspondents Association, were you troubled that the president chose not to attend the annual dinner last spring? This came up in one of our spring panels, and I was just curious.
The president decided not to go to the White House Correspondents Association dinner, and I think I was told later that he didn't realize that his staff wasn't going to go either. My basic view is the White House Correspondents Association dinner has just gotten too big. When I was president of the association, there were 1,500 people at the dinner. This last year it was 3,000, twice the size, in the same ballroom. Tells you how crowded it has gotten. Basically, it is protocol to invite the president, and the president doesn't want to come. The president doesn't have to come. We were all disappointed, but you got to be grown up about these things. I think it just told you that he The president didn't want to be seen looking like he was yucking it up with a bunch of elite reporters who he doesn't care for much. So I was not offended. I was not annoyed. It was a little easier to navigate the ballroom, because there were virtually no administration officials there, and so presidents just to do what they want to do about that kind of stuff. And I don't believe he probably would have helped himself had he come and been a little self-deprecating. My experience in attending way too many of these White House Correspondents Association dinners is that usually people who are there do themselves some good. Same is true for the gridiron dinner. I remember a famous former governor of Wisconsin who came out and did a little skit with a red sweater with a big white W on it, poking fun at himself, and I think people came out of that feeling much more kindly to Governor Dean. Nancy Reagan really helped herself when she went to, I think it was the gridiron, and did a poke fun of. Was that the same one?
Yeah,
it was great. There was a tag team match. Nancy Reagan and Howard Dean. She came out.
It wasn't the same one.
Okay, but Nancy Reagan came out dressed more or less in rags, and she poked fun at her tendency to spend a lot of money on clothes, and it brought down the house, and it probably helped her and helped her husband. So usually engagement is better than non-engagement, but presidents are entitled to do what they want to do vis-a-vis the press.
One thing that's unique about this, I mean, first of all, the president's very unique. He was a very unique candidate. No one else in America could have run the campaign and non-campaign that he ran and elected president. He didn't come in with a team that had been around the White House before. He basically, half the people that were appointed to the White House weren't for him, right up to Inauguration Day. There were big battles internal between, and there have been in the past, power centers, and the way you sort of get Steve Bannon would say something, the previous would say something, and someone else would say something else. I'll say this, General Kelly, I think, has brought some order to the White House. It's not perfect in any way, shape, or form. But it's also a president who's about marketing. I mean, he wants every single day, it's like when he was a big player in New York, he wanted Page Six to write great things about him. No national political figure or even state or local political figure ever gets all the things they want. And I think that's part of the tweeting activity. It's a team in there that basically sort of every day aren't quite sure what he's going to do. The most difficult job, I think, in the White House, I know Sarah Huckabee very well. I chaired her father's campaign 8 years ago. She was not an experienced press person. She had never been involved in the press. She basically, her father wanted to have a good job, and she got to be the deputy press secretary. After poor Spicer got killed and left, she stepped into that role. I think she's grown in the job. I think she struggles with it. But if you stand out there every day and not knowing exactly what the president's going to say or do or how, it's kind of hard to answer all the questions. So I think to a certain extent, normally you're running full speed the first 100 days. We're now in the 9th, 10th month, and I think it's more of a learning experience. And I think to a certain extent, everybody wants to move the press out of the press room in the White House and move them over to the old executive office building. Every White House I've been a part of, that's always part of the discussion. Get them off the pool, get them out of the building, get them as far away as possible. It's always a rumor, it never happens. The reality is, there's some people there that are veterans. I think what's a little better about some of these past White Houses is it's not the old guard who used to sit in the first row, Tom, and they were the first questions asked, and they were the people who sort of got paid attention to. Today, there's many, many ways of media. So what happens if you don't basically get it right out of the press room, you go to some of the sources. So what I'm always amazed by and what drives Trump nuts is there'll be a story in the Washington Post and the New York Times that 14 people in the White House said, not on the record, of course, or 29 people have commented on such and such. And part of that is a good reporter goes around and has his sources, and he goes and checks and sees what a story is happening. No one deliberately, that I know in my long experience, sets out to write a negative story about the president per se. They set up to write a story they think is honest, and they think and get pushed different ways by the sources. And I think part of this is again, as you said, we're going to have to reteach the course of the American presidency. And I don't know whether this is an aberration. This will be a one-time president who was a celebrity reality TV show host, and whether he's good, bad, or indifferent, we'll see as time goes on. But I think to a certain extent, the uniqueness of this White House is that you have a bunch of people in there who never either experienced in White Houses or government or any of the rest of it. And it's been a learning experience every single day, going 1,000 miles a minute. It's a tough place to learn. It's like you just enter as a freshman in a university, and all of a sudden you're taking doctorate courses.
I forgot to say something earlier, and that is I talked about how there is less information in this White House. On one level, you don't have tax returns, you don't have presidential medical data. The amount of time devoted to a dialogue in the briefing room has been shortened. On the other hand, the tweets give you more insight into where the president's head is 12 times a day. And on some level, that's important. If your job as a White House correspondent is to figure out what the president is thinking, what he's doing, what he's thinking about doing, these tweets, controversial though they may be, many of them drive his staff crazy, but the sum of these tweets give you some real sense about where the president's head is, and that's useful. That's useful. It's also cannon fodder for stories, too, because just when you think you're going to be writing about health care, you discover that because of a tweet or two, you're writing about Trump taking on the NFL or somebody else, or a Florida congresswoman who claims he disrespected the widow of a soldier who died in Niger. So whatever you think about the tweets, they provide insight and a window into a president and his thinking that have not been available before.
So you would say for journalists, Tom, then the tweets are beneficial from a reporting purpose.
Right, that's right. I mean, many people in this White House and in this government have said, not just Democrats, but people in this government and in this White House who've said, we wish we could stop him from tweeting. It really complicates our life. And people at the State Department really feel like that many of his foreign policy tweets really complicate dealing with exponentially serious issues like North Korea and the state of the North Atlantic Alliance and others. But as I said, they give you a window into what the president's thinking, and that's part of the name of the game for reporters, to know what the president is up to, what he's thinking, what's on his mind. And we get a lot more of that than we did in previous White Houses. I mean, Trump has developed the tweet into an art form for better or worse, and I think he does it because that's who he is. He's comfortable with it, and I also think he uses it as a way to gin up and reinforce his base. But you're still getting information as a reporter about what he's up to and what he's thinking, and that's not a terrible thing.
Okay. Thank you. I hadn't thought of that perspective, but that's the risk to American democracy is maybe countered by the information, and certainly gives opportunity for people to respond. I'm going to ask. I have several more questions, but I'll ask one, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Howard, you'll be pleased to know you started this discussion by talking about your dislike of the media, particularly when you were in elected office. And there was actually a study by the Kennedy School at Harvard just after the 100 days mark that found that the tone of news coverage in the first 3 months of the presidency was 80% negative to 20% positive. So kind of reinforcing the point that you made about why many politicians don't like the media or have a complicated relationship. Could you tell us from an elected official's perspective, though, how can that relationship be most cooperative when, in some ways, journalists and public officials have very different interests? If the tone were positive, if it were the other way around, 80% of the coverage were positive to 20% negative, I think that would suggest that journalists weren't doing what they're supposed to do. So what's the balance?
This is incredibly complicated because both journalism and politics is going through an enormous flux, and nobody can know where it's going to end up. Actually, I did not have much trouble with the media when I was governor. Vermont's a very small place. Everybody knows if somebody wanted to be a hot shot and show up, they were basically shut up by the other reporters if they were just being ridiculous. And, there were stories, of course, that I didn't like. But it was never the open warfare that happened when I ran for president. But I think what really happened was the rules are changing dramatically. And I think it's because it's a corporatization of the media. And I'm not talking about corporatization. The media calls up, Comcast calls the anchor on NBC and tells them what to say. Rupert actually does sometimes do that in Fox, but not that often. But in general, I don't think it's the corporatization of the media is a problem because corporations tell the media what to say, for the most part. I think the real problem is news has become a profit center. And in the heyday of great news, with the people that Ed was talking about, Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley and so forth, they all lost money. And Bill Paley, who ran CBS at the time, didn't care because he had the most trusted man in America delivering the news, and he was going to sell a hell of a lot of soap on The Price is Right or whatever was following up into the news. So journalists were rewarded for being respectable, respected, and trusted. Then you get this enormous change where the entire media, because of the internet, is now, and because of corporate ownership, it's now about what gossip can you get on television that attracts people. So, Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley and Howard K. Smith decided what the news was. They were never going to write about John Edwards' love child because that had nothing to do with the management of the economy or the defense. That just wasn't going to be on the evening news, maybe in the National Enquirer or whatever, but not in the evening news. Now, and for a long time, it was a scramble to get whatever you could get out there, whether it was true or not, and the more sensational, the better. And then respectable outlets suffered because they weren't competitive with these outrageous things that were being printed, and anybody could get anything anywhere because there were no editors anymore. I think what's happening now, and this may be my perspective because the media is very negative about Trump, and of course so am I, but I think what may be happening now is the maturing of some internet news sources, including most of the mainstream media, which now has a significant, most of them are now figured out, if not how to solve the problem, what direction they're going in. And of course you get the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the National Journal and all these people now online have a significant, and they get rewarded for being taken seriously where others are not. And there are other organizations, BuzzFeed, Vox, ProPublica, which are trusted news sources. They have a point of view, but they're trusted. And then there's crap, like the Daily Beast, which I'm not a fan of, which is Newsweek, basically. And, I know some of the journalists out there. I know what they were like during the campaign. They write point of view stories, whether they're factual or not. So the question in my mind is, are we in this enormous period of flux where media organizations have gone out of business and are suffering? Are we now getting towards the end of that, where the respectable, quote-unquote, mainstream media, which has done a great job for the most part for a long time until they were forced to make it into a profit center, are we now coming out of that, where they have now gotten their legs again, and the more scurrilous sites like Breitbart and so forth. Breitbart gets 15 million views a month. So what? There's 310 million people in this country. There's always a quota for crazy people who are going to read whatever they want on my side and on the Republican side. Breitbart is irrelevant, and I wish people would stop writing what they say because they're crazy. But there's a mainstream media that isn't crazy and that does actually do their best, as Tom was talking about. And I'm sort of thinking maybe they're in the ascendancy again, and I would think that would be a very welcome thing. I do believe our democracy is healthy. It is under stress. We've never had a president who went after the media the way they are. I think there's still a large multiplicity of opinion that you can read that's basically factual from all sides of the aisle, and I think that's a good thing. I'd love to know what you think about this.
Well, I think a lot about fake news. I was trying to think, how many stories that I personally know about that have been retracted because they were wrong. And in the last several months, the two big ones were CNN had to retract a story about, I've forgotten exactly what it was, but they had to retract a story, and they forced out several of the people involved in that story. And Fox News, of all people, had to retract something a few months ago because it wasn't true. But if there's a list of other stories from the mainstream media that were had to be retracted because they were wrong, I'm waiting to see that list. And so, for the most part, I think there's not a lot of fake news. I mean, there's some fake news on the part of some who allege the media is committing fake news, but I don't want to get into a polemical discussion about that. But Governor Dean is right about the pressure, not just to be a profit center, but to be first. I think the internet is a wonderful thing, and more information in a democracy is always better than less information, period. But there are pressures that we didn't used to have. In the old days when I started, there was no internet. And there were two news cycles. There was the Today Show morning cycle, and there were the evening news cycles. Now, the news cycle has become what somebody described as a news cyclone. And it's not just getting a good story, it's getting it out there. In the old days, which might have been the good old days, we had a phrase at Newsweek called technical exclusives. And what that meant is if you had a great story on Wednesday, Washington is a town full of really good reporters. And if you got a great story on Wednesday, the odds were you were going to lose that because the Times or the Post or the Journal or the LA Times or somebody would have that story before you came out on Monday morning. Well, now you can never use that as an excuse because if you got a great story, you can have it on the web in 3 minutes. And so there is a pressure to get the story, but get it out there first, and sometimes corners are cut. I'll see stories, and I'll say, what editor left that paragraph go into this story? And usually the answer is there wasn't an editor. And that's not good. I mean, I was at the New York Daily News for 16 years. I edited about 10,000 stories, and I was the person who got to say, who gave you that? Who's the second source? We need a third source or a fourth source. I mean, I agree with this notion that one of the ways media tries to inoculate itself against the president's fake news charges is to do things like Ed and Governor Dean suggested. There was a story in the Washington Post this week that talked about this story about how the White House staff tries to manage President Trump to keep him within the lanes. They cited 19 officials, White House officials, congressional people, people who recently left the White House, because that was a way to say, hey, we didn't just hear one guy talking over at a bar last night and we put it in the paper. We talked to 19 people. Earlier this year, it was either the Post or the Times that did a similar story that cited 27 different sources. In the old days, that would never have happened, but that's good because it says, this is just not a casual fly-by-night. The editor said, hey, let's do a story saying X. 27 sources, 19 sources should suggest to people that we take this more seriously. On the other hand, in the last 10 years, I was at a dinner with an editor who will remain nameless, not at National Journal, of course, but he said, we got this story a couple of weeks ago, and we put it right out because this is a story too good to check. There is no story too good to check. Some of my greatest stories are still in my notebooks because I had an editor, now very sick, sad to say, who would say, I need more than one person. Or, have you thought about the motivation? Does this person have an axe to grind? Why did you get this? Was it too easy for you to get this? How did this happen? You've got to have editors who are willing to do that, and in an environment where you can have an editor who says this story is too good to check, that's not good. Now that rarely happens, but I'd be lying if I suggested that it never, ever happens. And for the most part, it has to do with news organizations who I would call kind of quasi-journalists, quasi-news organizations, but that's a problem. And I do think when you have an owner like Jeff Bezos who would spend $250 million to buy the Washington Post and has basically unlimited pockets, I think you can hire more editors, you can insert more quality control into your process, and that's a positive development.
Thank you, Tom. We're going to move to questions in a moment. I just want to say that you actually brought us right back to the title of the panel, Breaking News or Making News. The two stories, the two retractions you mentioned were both in June, I think. The CNN story was about alleged collusion between a Russian bank and Trump allies during the election. CNN retracted that pretty quickly. The Fox News story was about the death of the DNC staffer, Seth Rich, and there were some more complications there. But I think our discussion today has shown that by and large the media do break news, not make news, with some exceptions. Let's open this up for questions. Because this is being a taped event, we have to ask you to come up to the microphones. We have several classes here, and I'm going to ask if the students from the classes could please come forward. I'm going to try to take a few student questions and then, of course, expand to everybody. But the students sometimes take a couple minutes, so let's give them a second to come up. And if we could keep the questions very short so we could have as many questions as possible. So I have one coming down here and one here, and then I'll come right to you, ma'am, right after that. Please, 1, 2, 3.
I have a news flash that just came across. Breitbart just broke the crazy ex-governor of Vermont that attacked 15 million viewers saying they're not credible.
Is that true?
That's fake news.
I expect
Please,
them to tune into this.
Hi there. Oh, hi. So you mentioned about getting news from a lot of different sources and the importance of having like a multiplicity of outlets that you examine. I know you're all associated with different organizations, so I understand if you can't outright say, but if you had to recommend like 3 to 5 sources that you think the public would benefit from just checking every day, could you do that? And if not, what should we look for when we're picking what news outlets we're getting our news from?
Are you talking about news organizations or individuals?
Either.
Well, sometimes I'm asked, who do you read every day? And I would say, I read everything I can get my hands on from Dan Baltz of the Washington Post, from Jerry Seib, the Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, the Lexington columnist for The Economist, which might be the best edited publication in the world, The Economist, and I read Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal. There are plenty of good news organizations and good journalists out there who don't have axes to grind, and that's what I try to look for. Dan Baltz, Jerry Seib, people like that are just terrific. I have great respect for Bret Baier of Fox News. I have great respect for Brit Hume of Fox News. I have great respect for Fred Barnes of the Weekly Standard, my former racquetball partner until our knees and our ankles gave out. But there's plenty of good reporters out there who are not grinding an axe. I also read Charles Krauthammer, a really smart, intelligent guy.
I avoid opinion pieces from everybody, even people I like. I read, probably in order, the Financial Times, New York Times, USA Today, because they have a great sports page, and The Economist. And I also read online, Vox, BuzzFeed, people with reach. I try to avoid the crap. I do read HuffPo, but there's a fair amount of gossiping there as well as I sort of read that because of my political leanings, but I take it with a grain of salt. And I'm like that. I try to read everything I get my hands on. The other thing I read without fail is a newsletter called the Euro Observer, because I am a huge fan of the European Union. I think what happens in Europe is unbelievably important and is mostly ignored. It's also why I read the FT first, because I think what's going on in the rest of the world, at the Times is terrific, but these days it's mostly about Trump, and I'm not that interested in Trump.
If you don't have 4 hours a day to read like I read, which I assume most of you don't, there's a publication called Real Clear Politics. It's kind of a summary. It's a free online. It's a summary of a variety of stories. It's not just politics. It's edited by a very dear friend of ours, Carl Cannon, whose father, Lou Cannon, was one of the great contemporaries of Tom's, who wrote for the New York Times for the Washington Post for many years. I start with the New York Post. Then after that, I'm conservative. Then I go to the Washington Post. Then I go to the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and I read a lot of the people that you read. Reading as many things as I read the same story 15 different times, and unfortunately, when you get to my age, sometimes you don't realize you just have read that story. But I think the key thing, what I worry most about for young people particularly, is you're not in the habit of reading newspapers. You're in the habit of sort of specializing, and so. And I grew up with newspapers and spent my life always reading newspapers. And the problem with television is, and obviously we're all on television. I've been on television for 30 years. You only get bits and pieces, so you've got to kind of. But I think the key thing with a computer today, with an iPad and all the rest of it, is sort of don't just basically say I want all the liberal stuff. Again, the message I've given to my daughter is read a little of both and make up your own judgments because. There's no perfect story, there's no perfect columnist, there's no perfect writer. But at the end of the day, you do want to know what's going on, and it's and I think the key thing, besides the Yankees coming back and going to win the World Series, but I think at the end of the day, Boston got there's a lot out there to read.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if you have a question for a specific person.
I think it's not to be afraid of yet. I think he does have an authoritarian personality, and most people who have his kind of money and run their organization the way he does have an authoritarian personality. Business is an authoritarian place for the most part, and more top-down than democracy. This is an incredibly strong country. I think people don't realize how strong we are. First of all, we're incredibly decentralized. So we don't have an economic policy that's made in Washington. Once in a while, somebody will pass a tax bill every 3 decades that has a lot to do with what happens economically. But basically, American economic policy, unlike the parliamentary democracies, is made by the chair of the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve Board and 50 million business people who, in the aggregate, decisions are aggregated, expressed in the marketplace, both on Wall Street and off Wall Street, which is more important, and that's our economic policy. So the decentralization of this country and the strength of the First Amendment, which is extraordinary, really, I think it would be incredible, and the fact that Trump is unbelievably disorganized. I mean, we are not on the verge of an authoritarian territory. There are many people in the government who would like to have an authoritarian government. It's not going to happen. So we have to get through this. We can have a debate about how competent Trump is, and I think he's totally incompetent for a variety of personality reasons. But the fact is, I don't think our democracy is in danger. But that doesn't mean it couldn't be. And one reason Donald Trump is president of the United States is because a lot of people your age didn't vote, and that has to change.
The key thing is I wish he would have taken Nina's course before he became president, or at least the introduction of the Constitution. The Constitution is a brilliant document, and the more you see it in action, the more difficult it was to put together, but it works. We teach, of course, in all the presidents. We start with the first president, There have been good presidents, there have been great presidents, there have been mediocre presidents, there have been presidents who have been murderers, and I don't think there's ever been one quite like this one. But the country will survive, and there's a Congress that basically sometimes, I think Trump's frustration is, as a business leader or what have you, if he wanted to build something in New York, he basically went and paid off the city councilman or whoever he needed to pay off, or the Las Vegas gambling casinos, and he went and did it. He didn't realize that I said to him one time, think of the Congress as your banker. They control the money, they control the resources, and I've always hated my bankers. And I think to a certain extent, he doesn't understand the powers that they have. Then there's the third element that we don't get talked about very much, is the court system in this country. It's an extraordinary system. Federal judges have tremendous power. The Supreme Court ultimately basically does use the Constitution and the interpretation of the Constitution. So the checks and balances are extraordinary. There's someone that said to me, I get a call every so often from Democrats or Republicans in Washington saying, are we going to survive? I said, are you talking about the country? Or are you talking about the Republican Party? The country will survive, the Republican Party maybe not. And I think that's more, I think the internal party debates are more significant. Democrats are chaotic and our party is certain. But I think at the end of the day, we'll survive Trump. He may turn out to be a decent president. Who knows? It's just, and what are the circumstances and what are the things? But don't lose faith in the system. The system is an extraordinary system. And it's what many other countries around the world, new democracies, try to evolve themselves. And I think what a lot of us thought is that when Trump worked for presidents, I assumed that when he got elected, he was going to basically be surrounded by people who would sort of show him the gravity of the job. And I think that was what we saw before as a candidate, and it's sort of someone, I always tell people 70-year-old men don't change, so my sense is the Congress is stepping up a little bit. The biggest problem we have is the partisanship that is so severe in the Congress, and I think that doesn't matter whether it's Democrats or Republicans control it.
Thank you. I see 3 more questions here. 1, 2, 3. We're going to try to get through all 3 of them. Please, go ahead.
Well, we don't get to make those rules. We in the press have to advocate as robustly and as vigorously as we can for more access. And below the radar, I can tell you, the White House Correspondents Association constantly engages with the Trump press office to try to expand access in large ways and small. And sometimes the Correspondents Association wins a modest victory. Sometimes they tell us to go stand in the corner, but there's a perpetual engagement. I just think part of it is just the need for control on the part of this White House and every White House. I mean, nobody is ever going to get the kind of access I got with Gerald Ford, sitting on 16 years worth of interviews until he had died. Nobody will ever have the access with Vice President Pence that 6 reporters had with Vice President Ford on a little tiny Air Force Two. It was so small it was called Slingshot Airways by the press. Ford came up to the press section with a double martini and just shot the breeze, and it was all off the record. Nobody violated the off-the-record rule ever, but it was a very easy, comfortable arrangement. Gerald Ford, as vice president, felt like he had an obligation to have press conferences, and wherever he went, even in the midst of Watergate, he had a press conference on every trip because he thought that was his obligation as the second-ranking official in the land to inform people. And I don't think that's. I don't think vice presidents or presidents since have felt that strongly about access. So it's just the old. What is the old line? Eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. We in the press and we in the country have to be vigilant and work as hard as we can to make sure that access isn't restricted further. But I think because of the need of control, it's going to be harder and harder to do that. But we got to keep trying, and hopefully the next president, whoever he or she is, will be a little more will understand that if you don't engage with the press, you lose your opportunity to tell your side of the story. And so I hope it'll get a little bit better, but I don't think it will be under this administration. And I mean no disrespect to the president or their people or his people, but this is their philosophy. Their attitude is we've got a way to go above the heads of the media directly to the people. Every president I've covered has wanted to do that, and I think President Trump, through his tweets and his use of social media, has been able to be more successful in that aspect of the job than previous presidents.
Since neither Pence nor the president drank, a martini press conference would be really interesting.
Well, also, today is no real off the record. I remember a very prominent journalist who I actually like a lot joking around about something I did when I was running for president. And I said, as we were leaving this informal dinner that was designed to introduce me to the Washington press corps, this guy says, I said, this guy's a very good guy. He said, so that was all off the record, right? And he goes, yeah, it sure was. And that's what we agreed to. And off the record in Washington means we can't put it in tomorrow's paper, but it's okay for Sunday. And you know, so I actually have everything on the record because I know there's no such thing as off the record, because Tom did get an enormous, I mean, he's probably right. There'll be never another thing like that. Or there may be, but it's idiosyncratic. There has to be an enormous bond of trust. And in the atmosphere that we've had, that's difficult. But let me just say, as somebody who really, I wrote a small book after I got off the campaign trail. It's a whole chapter naming names about press corps people that I didn't trust and why. I have to say that better that than having any kind of restraint on the First Amendment. We're going to have to sort out what the Russians put out there on Facebook, and Facebook's going to have to clean up their act and all that stuff. Better that than having some sort of even informal censorship. People, you know, there's been a lot of stuff that's been censored over the press in the old days, especially in wartime. It turned out to be pretty bad and not in the best interest of the republic. So a vigorous First Amendment, much as those of us in the business feel like we've been victimized by it, cannot be subverted, because the danger, that is a danger to democracy. Once you start making compromises, we need a better editing function, as Tom pointed out. We need somebody who's going to hold their feet to the fire and not put crap out there that's not true, because that does erode press confidence. But the truth is, the only reason that we don't steal you blind is because we're going to get caught and it's going to be in the paper. And there's still people who try it. But it is self-correcting. And the strength of the First Amendment is just absolutely essential to the functioning of a country that's strong.
No, go ahead, please. You can. Thank you. Tom, can you answer? No, I think that was directed to you, and then we'll try to get in on that.
Well, this is the age-old problem. I mean, for as long as I've been at the White House, and it'll be 50 years in June, I've fielded complaints from people saying, "Why can't you put people's names on that story?" This White House complains about that, but they use it. They leak too. I remember when Attorney General Sessions was on President Trump's bad list for recusing himself on an appointment of a special prosecutor. After Sessions had been up on the Hill, the next day there was a story saying that's what he said yesterday was not correct. He had met with some Russians. Now that came out of the White House. I can tell you for a fact that came out of the White House. So it's a political tactic to decry and complain about leaks from unnamed sources, but sometimes the unnamed sources are in the government, and sometimes are the very same person who is complaining about unnamed sources. It's the way it's done. I mean, I've always said that leaks are the mother's milk of politics and diplomacy. And in all my years in Washington, I've only had one leak from somebody whose identity I didn't know. It was from a letter from the American Embassy in Bonn when Bonn was the capital of Germany, complaining about Reagan officials buying Mercedes Benzes at a diplomatic discount when they were over advancing a Reagan trip to Germany. But every other leak that I've gotten, I know who it came from. And many times, I mean, a couple of famous stories, I guess I should write them someday, about somebody who was constantly complaining about unnamed sources, who was himself one of the more useful unnamed sources in that particular White House. So I agree that the anonymity is a theoretical problem with credibility. You're right about that. And I think that's another reason why, as we've discussed when the Washington Post and the New York Times and others are saying, this report is based on the interviews with 27 people, not one or two, but 27. I think that's an attempt to buttress credibility, because anonymous sources are a problem, but they're not going to go away. And it's just, I mean, if you don't do that, you have to at some point do due diligence and try to establish that what you've heard from from a source you can't identify is correct. And one of my favorite instances of that is about 10 years ago when the Washington Post got a Pulitzer Prize, when one of their reporters uncovered just unspeakably bad conditions for wounded warriors at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. They were living in squalor. These were people who had lost 1, 2, 3, and in at least one instance, all 4 of their limbs. And somebody leaked that story. And Bob Gates, who was the Secretary of Defense, not only fired a couple of generals, but he cleaned that up. Would anybody think that story shouldn't have been published from unnamed sources? I don't think so. So it's a double-edged sword. It's controversial. But I think on balance, unnamed sources will always be around, and it's incumbent on reporters to try your best to make absolutely sure that what you're hearing is legit before you publish it.
Thank you, Tom. I think if a very quick question, we can get a 1-minute answer. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to shorten it then. Speaking of credibility, and knowing that President Trump has really been all over the place with tweeting and kind of approval ratings with the voting in 2016, and where the registration about incoming registration has risen. Now with the use of social media over printed media as a preference for Trump, my question now is, for the people who don't really use social media, the credibility issue here of voting in the 2020 election and going forward, what to believe and what not to believe at this point.
I didn't hear that.
Trump has 50 million followers, so he's never going to go back to an old press conference, a press release. And I think that as time goes on, it'll expand. The only problem with tweets is there's no editing, again. And, it takes mainstream media or somebody else to point out that the tweet is not honest or responsible, or those aren't the facts. The facts usually end up being printed somewhere. And I think what Tom will tell you is anybody in the White House that lies to him on even once, they're done as a source. The critical thing, if you're going to be a source, you always have to tell the truth. And the truth ends up winning in the end, I think, most cases. But it's a real battle today because there's so many sidebar stories that get out there and everybody has a best interest. I think that the reality is that you're now seeing tweets being they're the vehicle of many people. They're rerun, they're repeated. I think social media is going to be looked at in a very hard way in the future based on the Facebook and all the rest of it. But it's never going to diminish, I don't think, at this point. I think people may get tired of it, but I think at the end of the day, it's still going to be out there, it's still going to be a factor.
This is an interesting problem because I've actually done some work on this. Gossip and rumors are part of our fabric as human beings. Gossip and rumors have had roles in society as long as there's been society. Now we've just had, it's expanded, it's electronic, everybody gets. But if any of you live in a really small town, which I have, it's just shocking what happens. And unfortunately, there are victims of this, but it has a social function, which is not always a positive one. So what we're really seeing in the media is a reflection of ourselves and who we are. And what we have to do is figure out, this is what was really happening is because of the incredible increase in power of individuals, not to have a referee between them and the action, they now have got to figure out how to sort out the fact from the fiction. And there's been fake news since there have been human beings that could describe the news. Now this fake news has real currency to it. I was thinking as we were having this dialogue, how interesting it seems, and it's too early to say this, but how interesting it seems that it may be that the old sort of media giants are now going back to becoming the arbitrators of all this insane stuff in the media because that's on social media, because they're actually the only people that still do have a real editorial function. And in order to be credible, some of the online places are now taking seriously the notion that they have to have an editorial function. I remember that one of the big gossip rags in Washington, which I won't name because they'll do a mean story about me, but their motto was basically get it first, and if it's not right, you can fix it later. I mean, I think that kind of stuff is not going to survive in the long run, but it will rear its head in some other function because this is part of who we are as human beings.
Please join, thank you. Thank you for a good concluding question. Please join me in thanking our panelists for a very informative conversation. We'll be continuing these discussions at Day of Dialogue next week and at several other events through the semester, and there are more details outside. Thank you again.
What is the name of that newsletter? The Euro Reporter?
Euro Observer. They have two versions. I don't do